Like I am amongst old friends, like you've said. Feels like yesterday when I was here, but of course it's been a whole year. So I hope everybody's been really well since then. I hope that your business ventures are going well. I hope that your personal lives are going well too, and that you haven't been too sadly impacted by the cost of living going up and these mortgage rate increases. So I've been asked today to talk a little bit about co-governance and the treaty. But of course, there are all things happening in politics at the moment too. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of the recent developments as well, if that's all right with you. And then hopefully we've got lots of questions. So it's always far more interesting for me if we have questions from the audience rather than being talked to and dictated to by a politician in the morning. So the first thing that's been on my mind, of course, has been the recent firing of Rob Campbell. I'm sure everybody's been following that. Now, I think it was untenable that his position remained, and it was for the reason that everybody is entitled to an opinion. Everybody here should be allowed to have their political opinions, but there's a very clear distinction between being a civilian or a member of the public in your opinion, and a person who is chair of a Crown entity having a public political opinion. And he breached a very clear and source of pride for the public service, which was public neutrality and being a public servant and serving not only the government of the day, but any future government. And I don't think this will have an effect on people who might be a nurse or a teacher or somebody working in any other organisation that's Crown funded. But it's important that people in the leadership positions show leadership, that we must have a neutral public service that is able to implement whatever policy the government of the day is there to do, that was elected by the people. Because we as politicians are elected by you, and public servants are there to help implement the policies that the public sought to elect. And I think that's really important. The second thing that's been on my mind, of course, is this Savage Colonizers poem that was written, and the government gave $100,000 to it being put onto a stage show. Now, in this poem, it essentially was a racist, hate-fueled poem, and it said that James Cook was a savage colonizer. Everybody who came here who was his descendants and all other white people should be stabbed. And they should be tracked down and stabbed with pig knives. Now, there's been a huge amount of outrage in the last few days that the government actually funded this piece of creative art. And I was on RNZ just this morning, and they says, oh yeah, but this is completely different to what happened to the Christchurch attacks, wasn't it? I said, no, not at all. They're actually quite similar. Because what they're saying is, there is people, a lot of people in this room, who inherently deserve violence because of what they look like. Not because of anything that they've done or any individual characteristics, but because of their race. And as much as I'm a proponent of free speech, I don't believe anybody should ever go out there and say that people based on an ism, like their race, are inherently bad people or inherently deserving of violence. And so I think the government should actually go out there and say they withdraw the money from that project, and it was wrong, and challenge the board who actually decided to give money to this project to answer why they did it in the first place. Because as taxpayers, I think we deserve better. But all of this is wrapped up into this theme of, well, what does it mean to be a New Zealander in the 21st century now? We've got a lot of cultural division going on. We're constantly hearing from the government that they want to either place people into categories of being a villain or a victim, and we're hearing this through the education system as well, where we've got now people being funded to create more of this division, and we equally have government departments being separated based on their race. And it seems like we are going further and further away from the idea of Enlightenment values that everybody inherently is deserving of dignity and everybody is equal under the human race. And I think that's where ACT, over this past year and going towards the future, will continue to campaign on. The idea that everybody has inherent rights and duties and they have dignity and we are all equal under the law. And it seems quite incredible to me that we're in 2023 and the idea that we are all equal under the law is somehow seen as this ghastly idea. And we shouldn't talk about it. And I think we do need to talk about it. The issue that got Rob Campbell in trouble was the issue of co-governance. And it was the idea that people should be placed on boards because of their race, rather than because of any of their skills or because they were democratically elected to a governance position. And I think that's wrong. When you look at the Three Waters example of water infrastructure, ACT has been very clear that when Labor said that they'd steal it away from local councils and local elected representatives, that we would repeal it and we would give it back. But we were also very clear that we don't agree that we should have people placed on boards because of their race. I think that's so divisive, and I think it's wrong. And I don't think it sets a good example for the next generation coming through, who might actually start to believe that they have different rights in our country and that they have different abilities to get into positions of leadership, not because of anything that they've done or strived to achieve for, but because of who they were and what they looked like. And I think that's wrong, and we have to remove that. But our policies have always gone a bit further. And we have said, councils, they don't actually have money for water infrastructure. We need to be smarter than that. My GST sharing bill at the moment is in Parliament, and it says every time a new house is built or developed around New Zealand, we would give half of the GST, or the value of that, back to the local council to help pay for the infrastructure. And on the latest projections, that's about $1.2 billion every year going to local councils up and down New Zealand to help pay for stormwater and wastewater infrastructure. And that's, I think, a smarter, less divisive policy than what the Labour Party have been putting out there, trying to take away assets from democratically elected people and ratepayers and giving it back to them. But this issue of co-governance is not just in Three Waters. It was across the healthcare reforms. And so we've also said that we would remove the Māori Health Authority because it's unnecessarily divisive. There is nothing that the Māori Health Authority will do that will improve health outcomes for Māori people that couldn't have been achieved under a health system that seeks to achieve it for all people. It's unnecessarily divisive. And once again, separating people in our country based on their race and their ancestry rather than their actual health needs. And I don't think that was right, so we will remove that. But it all goes back to culture. And over the past few years, we've seen an embracing of Māori culture, which I think is wonderful. I actually do think it's wonderful. And just the other week, our leader, David Seymour, went up to Waitangi and gave his speech in Te Reo Māori, and I think that was also really wonderful, because the chiefs up there said that they were only going to accept people that year to speak who could actually do it in Te Reo Māori. And he says, all right, I accept the challenge, which I don't think they were expecting of him. But he did it, and I think he did himself a good service, and I think he did all of his followers a good service. But he essentially was not accepted for what he said because people didn't want somebody to challenge the doctrine that only left-wing people or people who believe in dividing a nation based on people's race should be able to understand the treaty. And over the past few years, as we've been delving into what does the treaty mean and what does it mean to be a modern multi-ethnic New Zealander, we've discovered that a lot of the treaty principles and the ideas coming out of Wellington are completely wrong. Because if you look actually at the treaty, it says that in the Māori version, the government will have kawanatanga, which is the right to govern, and that all people will have tino rangatiratanga, which is the right to self-determination, and self-determination over their taonga or their property, which is property rights. Nobody's against that, and everybody from every race accepts that they want property rights over their own properties and their own things that they hold as value and assets. But it also says that they have ngā tikanga katoa ritatahi, which is the same rights and duties as all other people. So the Treaty of Waitangi is saying that the government should govern, people should be able to have independence and be able to choose how to live their own lives and to have rights over their property, and that we all have the same equal rights and duties under the law as every other person. So there's nothing in the treaty that says that we should be separating every government entity into two parts and having people separated into people who were here before the treaty was signed and people who were here after the treaty was signed, and all of their genealogy and ancestry going forward separated into two groups. It was saying that we all want to be equal and we all want the same laws. And I think that's wonderful. The difference here is, of course, that over time, and since 1840, a lot of Māori language was suppressed, and a lot of people did have their property rights taken from them. A lot of land was confiscated. And of course, that should be given back, and it has. That's what the Waitangi Tribunal did, and that's why we've had treaty settlement claims, because land that was supposed to be protected under property rights was taken. Anybody here would have hoped that that would happen to them too. And so I think it's important that we did get that back. And I think it's also really important that we have embraced the Māori language, because we are a mixture of culture, and I think it is a beautiful language. But where we need to be very clear is that the treaty never said that government should be separated based on people's race. It was government for all people, to allow people to have equal rights under it. What has happened is, over time with the land courts down in Wellington, they have created this idea that there was a partnership agreement, and that partnership was actually in the treaty, and it wasn't. And they've also created the idea that there were principles under the treaty, and the principles don't exist in the treaty. And so they've sought to create cultural divide where there was none. And so that's where we as a party think it's really important to culturally push back against the idea that we are not all equal, and that we don't all have the same sort of blood running through our veins, that we're all human, but that we should all be seen as different. I think we need to acknowledge our differences, but under the law, say that we're equal. So that's really what we're striving to achieve, is to push back against what Labour has been putting through in policy and making our country more divided, but also allow people the ability to talk about it. Because over the past few years, it feels to me that in individual conversations I've had with people, they feel a frustration that their children or their grandchildren are coming back from school telling them that they're wrong because of who they are by race, or that somebody has told them that they shouldn't be here in this country, or that they're wrong because their ancestors were colonizers and somebody else is a victim because they were colonized. History is extremely messy, and we need to draw a line in the sand and say we have to accept people as they are and acknowledge our differences, but be respectful of all people and have equal rights under the law. And it's as simple as that. So we want to create a Treaty Principles Act that says under the law, everybody has equal rights and duties under the law, and send that off to referendum. Now, I think overwhelmingly people would support that. the idea that we should all be equal under the law. I don't think it will come back unfavourable, but if it did, maybe that gives us the ability to talk about co-governance. But I suspect most people in New Zealand would say the idea that our government should be split in two and governance of entities be split in two, and people being placed on boards because of their race rather than because of their skills is unnecessary and divisive. I don't think people would support it if they knew what was actually happening and had the ability to talk about it and felt they had the ability to talk about it. So that's co-governance. But I also just wanted to end on a little bit about the cyclone as well. I hope nobody here was actually affected by the floods in Auckland, because I know a lot of people have been, and it's quite horrendous going out there in the community and seeing some of the devastation. But I was out in West Auckland predominantly and parts of Epsom, and I saw a lot of people who lost nearly everything. But importantly, I also saw a community wraparound with support. And every person I went out to see told me that they'd already had neighbours who had come out to give them warm clothes, food and water. I even met a person in her 90s who'd given up her own bed to her neighbour who had no home anymore. And that was really heartwarming. But down in Hawke's Bay, I also met a lot of people who had set up stations for volunteering. People were all coming around together, and I think that was the Kiwi spirit. We saw a lot of the horror of what can happen in nature, but a lot of the wonder of the Kiwi spirit and gathering together in community. And I think that's what Rotary is about as well. Everybody dipping into their own pockets to help each other out. We will have a lot of costs of rebuild still to come. And I think it's going to be a really challenging year for that. But we also need to look at what is the government's role. The community has done the bulk of the work, but what is the government here to do now? And we're going to see a lot of people wanting to put on another tax, or we're going to see people arguing to take on more debt. And I think it's more important that when we're in a cost of living crisis already, that we're not arguing for more tax, which would add more cost to people now, or more debt, which would just add more cost to people in the future. But we look at what the government's already spending its money on, and we reprioritise. Because I've found about $6.8 billion in the government's budgets already that you could cut overnight, and nobody would notice any difference. And we could use that money to help pay for the recovery. And another example would be the Auckland Light Rail. It's been put on hold for 5 years. It doesn't appear that anyone in Auckland actually wants it. It's only people in Wellington. And it's estimated to cost around $15 billion. Now if we cut that, that money could go to help for the cyclone recovery. I think that's far more important than arguing for more tax, which would become an ongoing tax, or more debt. But importantly, we're putting out a policy today, so look and stay tuned for David Seymour in Hawke's Bay, hopefully on the news today, talking about what our recovery package would look like. And now it's time for questions.
Yeah.
But one of the things that concerns me a lot is a government who pays money to the news media and says, look, we want you to support us with what we're doing politically, and pays them many millions of dollars to do so. And that seems to be continuing. What's your approach to that, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. The Public Interest Journalism Fund has gone a lot of ways to destroy our faith in media institutions. I don't think they are being paid enough to actually have changed their opinions in favour of the government. I think what's really difficult for people in the media at the moment is that there's so much information, and there are so many platforms and a lot of online platforms that they're having to compete with. So journalists have an incentive to just try and get as many clicks as possible onto their pages. And sometimes that means putting up articles that are not necessarily truly factual because it might get more readers. They also don't have as much time to create articles. Now, if you can remember back to the days where you might get one newspaper a day, a journalist was probably only writing one story a day. But now they're being asked to do 3 or 4. So the resource constraints that they have with the same amount of money makes their job very difficult. And so I actually do get journalists sometimes calling me up asking for comment, and within half an hour they've got a story up online. The ability for them to fact check in that amount of time is impossible. So I agree that we shouldn't be spending our money like we have, because it does destroy faith in our institutions and our media, but I don't believe the amount of money that they've actually been given is enough for them to have changed their opinions for the government. I just don't think they've got enough time to write what they're being expected to write.
Thanks for your presentation, Brook. I mean, I just want to make a comment that I don't think it takes much of a scratch on the surface to find that racism is a prevalent part of our culture. And I do challenge, I mean, I support much of what Act is saying, and I haven't been a particular supporter of co-governance, but I don't think you need to go very far down the track in your own personal journey about Te Ao Māori to find that when people realise that you're learning te reo, the comments that come from your peer group and other people is quite astonishing. So I just challenge everybody that I think we need to consider our own inherent biases, and co-governance becomes a necessity in a country where one group of people are disadvantaged, and I see it with my grandchildren. So I think that the ability to influence a generation is far stronger at home when parents make a comment that's inflammatory in respect of treaty settlements, etc., than I see coming out of ECE and stuff with my grandkids. Okay. Where there's a very inclusive model, a multicultural model, and I just think that we all express racism, and we need to examine our own places. Yeah, well, I don't want to blame the government. I don't think any government can own our racism, is what I'm saying.
Well, well, no, thank you for your comments. What I would say to that is I don't think racism in any form is okay.
No.
But I think we also need to acknowledge that New Zealand is a modern, multi-ethnic, liberal democracy. And we are not just 2 races. We are over 200 races. And what I constantly hear from people is that they don't feel like they're part of the conversation at all. We are looking back in time and looking at what did New Zealand look like potentially in the 1950s, and putting people into 2 boxes and saying there is people who were here before the treaty, and there are people who are here after the treaty. And it seems to me that it's Māori and Pakeha meaning white. And that's what the government has been focusing on. But there's an awful lot of people who have been completely missed out of the conversation. We have Chinese population. We have a huge Indian population. We have a lot of Sri Lankans, a lot of people from South Africa. We have people from everywhere. And we're doing a disservice to our country by saying that we want a system that's divided into a race of one particular people, of Māori, and everybody else. Because I think a genuine modern multi-ethnic society would acknowledge that we have a lot of races, and we should say no to forms of racism no matter where it comes from. But I think the idea that would pigeonhole a whole race and say that there are separate government organisations or separate board placements because of your race is racist, and that will only create more division than accepting of all races. And just one more comment on that, on the health system, of course, because I think there can be abilities for people to create by Māori, for Māori health provision, in the same way that there can be by Chinese for Chinese and by Indian for Indian health provision. I think that that's acceptable under a health system, but to say that a whole race of people need a separate health system is wrong. But I agree, there is racism.
It's the challenge between Indigenous and post-colonial. And every country struggles with it. Yeah. Don't they?
Yeah.
I'd just like to pick up on your comments about the health system.
Speak louder.
As someone who's worked in the health system for all of my career, so I'm not a child, as you can see, I'm ageing. And I've managed services at a registered nurse, so I've worked at the clinical coalface with people, and I've managed services at national, regional and local level, so I understand the health system really well. The co-governance model is being really misrepresented and talked about incorrectly. People just need to look. The media is full all the time that we're short of doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, etc., etc. So common sense tells us New Zealand does not have capacity for two separate health systems. So the Māori Health Authority has been set up not to deliver a separate health service, not to deliver a separate health system, but to address inequities in the health system. And anyone who's worked in the health system will know that we've got major inequities. That when you look at our statistics within New Zealand and then you compare them with OECD and look at other countries, that the Indigenous people of New Zealand, the Māori population, have much lower health status than the general population. When you start drilling into that further and you work with people from all the different cultures you talk about, people who are Indigenous in their own cultures and their own lands understand Indigenous people and their rights and their whakapapi, their connection to their country and their land. So you need, when you talk with Pacific people, when you talk with Indian people, when you talk with other Asian cultures, they understand that they are new people to this land and that they want to work within the systems that we have. And they work really well with that. We only need to look at COVID and we only need to look at the newest things that have happened with the latest emergencies. In South Auckland, the Indian Sikh community opened up their temples and provided food and shelter for people. Pacific groups did the same. If we go back and look at COVID, when there wasn't good immunisation levels happening, as soon as the Maori services, the Pacific services, the Indian and the Chinese services started working with their own people, their levels of vaccination went way up. So the Māori Health Authority is not about setting up a separate health system. It's about addressing the inequities and reshaping how we connect the people who most need the health services into the health services, and that the Pacific are doing the same. So I think it's really unfair and really sets back progress when people start talking about setting up a separate health system. And one of those, as my last comment, one of the co-chairs of the Māori Health System was the former chair of the Bay of Plenty District Health Board. Sharon Shea, Māori woman, managed a non-cultural health service. She's not there to set up a separate health system. She's there with her knowledge and skill around how to pull the health system together and make it work for everybody. So I do challenge those comments that it's about setting up a separate health system.
We're just aware of time, and Brook has said that she can stay after the meeting to have further conversation. So maybe one quick question.
Look, if you're all sitting in the one boat and you're all supposed to be going in the same direction, you can't have people doing different things and facing in different directions. And I think we've got to have the one country, we've got to have the one thing looking after us all. Have a look at the treaty, have a look at the Maori version of the treaty and what it says, and it says one for all ordinary New Zealanders it talks about. It doesn't talk about people by race or little cliques or little groups. We're all in the same boat together. That's what we should be thinking about, and not worrying about what you're worrying about. If we're all in the boat and it's working well, it's got to work well, it's more likely to work well if we're all in the same boat together.
That's what I've just said,
Yes.
that Māori Health Authority is about making sure everybody is having the
It
same
doesn't have to be
access.
married, I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be.
I'll,
Really quick.
Yeah.
Referee,
Look what you
please.
started.
Yeah, so thank you both for your comments. I think what's really important here is what you've said about the Pacifica people and the Indian people knowing how to reach out to their population groups and be able to help people in the community. But they're not calling for a separate organisation with a board of governance and a separate entity. They are already able to do that within the existing organisational structure. So what is it that's different about one particular race of people that can't do that under an organisation that the other types of people are able to, but they require a completely separate board of governance and a completely separate entity? I think that's wrong. I think that's unnecessarily divisive, because if we took it to its extreme, you'd then be calling for a Pacific People's Authority and an Indian People's Authority and a Sri Lankan People's Authority. No other race under our law is wanting a specific authority of governance and a specific amount of pooled money for a completely separate authority outside of the health system. I think it's important that under the one health system that we have, we acknowledge the differences of all people, and we acknowledge that there may be different needs for different communities under our organisation. But to separate out one specific group of people and say that there should be a different authority with board representatives specifically picked because of their race is wrong. And I do think that is wrong, and it's unnecessarily divisive. I think every community should be supported, and we should find new ways of working with different population groups to create better health outcomes. But I don't believe it will go any way to helping our country to divide our organisations into two.
Okay. Bob, would you like to say words of appreciation?
Thanks, Brook, for coming along, and I think it's a very divisive subject, I think, and it's good to talk about it.
Challenging topic.
Yeah. Just like the club to give our appreciation. Yeah.